Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Library of Virginia for our noontime presentation on early American migrations. My name is Cassandra Farrell. I am the senior map archivist at the Library of Virginia, and this presentation is being held to complement our current exhibition, which is Mapping the Commonwealth 1816 to 1826, that is on display in our gallery, and will be open until June 7, 2025. So during today's presentation, my goal is to give you a broad overview of the roads that were in existence in early America, and also to give you an idea of what some of the migration routes were, et cetera, et cetera. It's British focus, British American, early American focus, so it doesn't extend into the areas that were covered by the French or by the Spanish during the 18th century. So I just wanted to say that up front. It is focusing on the British American colonies and as well as the early United States of America after the American Revolution. So in saying all that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I will request that you place your questions in the chat section, and we will get to those after I finish the presentation. So let's get going. As I said earlier, the title for this presentation is Early American Migrations, and the map that's on the screen is a map of the United States postal roads that was published in 1796. The main author is Abraham Bradley, and it very nicely identifies the roads that had been constructed, that were in use after the American Revolution. It shows you where Virginians and where New Englanders and where New Yorkers were settling and moving in just before the year 1800 and in between the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So, starting with the 17th and 18th century, how do you travel? You travel by road. And when I say road, I'm using that term loosely. It could very well be a trail. It could be very well be a horse path. You could travel on carriage, but most likely you're probably traveling on horseback. And so when I say the word trail, or when you hear the word trail or read the word trail for the 17th and 18th century America, just remember it could very well be just a dirt path. And American colonists, British colonists also traveled by water. In fact, this was one of the main ways in which you traveled in colonial America, especially in the 17th and early parts of the 18th century. There were roads, but it was just as easy to travel by water. And the map I have on display right now was completed in the early 1670s by Augustine Herman, who was a Bohemian and lived in the colony of New York. And he was a multi-talented individual. He was a surveyor, he was an ambassador, he was a merchant, and he created this map of Virginia and Maryland. And what he did is he identified the locations of settlements and also of early indigenous settlements and towns in the Chesapeake Bay area in the mid to late part of the 17th century. He did not identify the roads, but what he did do nicely is show where homes and settlements were located along the rivers. And if you look very closely, you can see he provides soundings and identifiers where some of the shoals are. This is because he's Dutch. Dutch background, I should say. He's Bohemian, but he has a Dutch training. And they placed a heavy emphasis on merchants traveling through the waterways and connecting with fellow merchants and plantation owners and farmers via the water. Because as you look at this map, you can travel up several waterways in Virginia and Maryland. And during that time period, there wasn't a major port town. So you could sail up to a person's plantation. They more than likely had a wharf where the merchant and the ship captain can dock, and then they could negotiate and make the exchanges from there. So it's very much an area where you could travel by water. And if you are traveling by water, here are some examples of the various types of modes of transportation you could use to travel by water during that time period. Here you have examples of a ferry boat. On my left-hand side, it shows people. You notice how it's set up for people to walk on the boat, necessarily not from the shoreline itself, but there's a kind of a platform that they could use to walk onto the boat. And then on the other side, you have an example of someone canoeing their livestock across the river. This is something that early American colonists would have scenes that would have been familiar to them. Also, on this next slide, we have further images displaying the types of canoes and boats that early American peoples and the colonists would be using to transport fish, to transport tobacco. If you look on the right-hand side, at the very top, you have colonists moving across the waters. Those are two canoes connected together with bales of tobacco on top. And so it was not uncommon in order for them to do that, put two canoes, put two ships together. I mean, not ships, but boats together, lay the hogshead of tobacco on them, and then transport them across the waterways. And then, of course, other modes of transportation are listed below that, wagons, and then, of course, someone on horse transporting a sole hogshead of tobacco. The early roads were little more than riding trails through the woods. And this is a picture that someone graciously took of the Great Wagon Road at Camden Battlefield. And it gives you a visual impression, a visual idea of what these roads would have looked like in the 17th and into the 18th century. And as you move into the 18th century, there are specific roads that emerge, major roads. For example, the Boston Post Road exists and is in use in the 17th century. There is a road called the King's Highway that was in operation in the 18th century. The Lancaster Road in Pennsylvania, which connected Philadelphia with Lancaster. There's a road called the Fall Line Road that ran from Fredericksburg, Virginia, down to the North Carolina line and into North Carolina. And then, of course, the Great Valley Road, which connected Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and the other colonies with Virginia into North Carolina through the Shenandoah Valley. And here's an example of a late 17th century map of New England. And it gives you a very good idea of the settlements that existed, the towns. There is a road, there is a Boston Post Road. And the Boston Post Road is named the Post Road because it was a post road. It was established in the 1670s to connect New England, Boston, with Long Island, New York, and to move the mail. And there was a postal system in colonial America. There were post offices from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, down to Virginia, and eventually into North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. A great many of them were in New England in the Middle States. And in fact, in the 18th century, the major post offices were located in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. So yes, there is a Boston Post Road, even though you can't see it. So if you're researching New England during this time period, although you're not seeing the road, you do see the settlements, the names of the settlements. And you also get a very good idea of how the waterways flow through the area, and ideas where there may have been ferries, and there were a lot of ferries in early America. There were a lot of ferries. So this map, which was published in 1729, was the first map to show the Post Road, the Boston Post Road, really clearly, and it shows the post offices, where the locations for post offices between Boston and New York City. And so you have, and it's also a map that shows you a road that early Americans would have used to travel back and forth. And as you see the roads, they come to a river. There may or may not be a bridge, most likely not. So there's probably a ferry that they have to use to travel across. And the post offices in these localities were more than likely located in taverns, which is just a continuation of the British practice, the European practice of setting up post offices in taverns and in coffee shops. So as you think about the early Americans and how they're moving about on horseback, by water, by carriage, they're traveling, stopping at taverns, perhaps going to a tavern to collect the mail, etc., etc. But this is a very nifty map, and if you're interested in it, you can get it through Wikimedia Commons. Now, as Americans move, in the 18th century, Virginians start to move away from the Tidewater area. And I'm assuming that a lot of you who are participating today are Virginians, and you know exactly where the Tidewater region is. It's along the coast, and it's dominated by the James River, the York River, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac rivers. And the settlement in 17th century Virginia was within the Tidewater area. In fact, throughout the colonial period, most colonists lived close to the water and to the Atlantic Ocean. Well, you start to see new counties formed in Virginia in the 18th century as Virginians start to move westward. And by the mid part of the 18th century, they're into the Piedmont region. They're living in the Piedmont region. You begin to see some Virginians moving past the Appalachian Mountain Range, or going into the Appalachian Mountain Range, crossing the Blue Ridge. But these mountains for many, many years were barriers to colonial expansion. In New England, settlers live along the Connecticut River Valley. And let me see if I can go back. Okay, so you can see the Connecticut River Valley. If you look closely, you can see the major rivers that run through Connecticut, New England, Massachusetts, and there are quite a few individuals who lived in what they call the Connecticut River Valley. By 1720 in New England, many of the best lands have been occupied, and you find a lot of families in New England who leave, and they the migration pattern for a family from New England that does decide to leave might look something like, okay, we leave New England, we move down to New York. 20 years later, the family decides to move to Pennsylvania. They continue to move further south into Virginia, and then they move into North Carolina before going into Kentucky. So what kind of roads or what kind of travel patterns existed as these folks moved down from New England into the Southern colonies? Or what were the travel patterns for, say, for those Quakers who leave Pennsylvania to move down to North Carolina during the 18th century? Well, let's take a look at those. So just keep in mind, I'm probably sounding like a broken record at this point, but colonists did move by water. They moved by post roads, and post roads is the roads where the postal mail was transported from town to town and locality by locality. The King's Highway, the Great Wagon Road, the Fall Line roads, and other routes that developed. And you do see more roads developed in the mid-18th century. Two of them were a result of the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. For example, Braddock's Road was constructed under General Braddock's supervision to move his army from Cumberland, Maryland. There should be a comma after Cumberland. Cumberland, Maryland to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For some reason, when the British Army arrived here, they didn't quite realize that in order to get to the forts in present-day Pittsburgh, you would have to go through mountain ranges and forests, and so they constructed a road that was 12 feet wide and could handle a marching army and wagons. And today that route is roughly United States Highway 40. Forbes Road was also constructed. It linked Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which connected basically Philadelphia to Harrison to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And then another road that really comes into use is the Wilderness Road, which is an extension of the Great Wagon Road that ran from Philadelphia down into Virginia and then ultimately into Kentucky because of the Wilderness Road. It's an extension of the Great Wagon Road that meanders its way over into Carolina, into Tennessee, back up into Virginia through the Cumberland Gap. And yes, this is the road that Daniel Boone helped to blaze. So you've got, by the 1770s, Virginians are moving across the Blue Ridge. They are moving into Kentucky. Kentucky was a colony, was a part of Virginia until 1792 when it became its own state. And then after the American Revolution, a number of Virginians moved to Ohio. And it's the same thing for New Englanders. You see New Englanders migrate after the American Revolution. Many moved to Ohio, and then others migrate to upstate New York, further inland into Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont. And we're going to take a look at why that occurred. And hopefully by looking at these maps, you can see and understand why they moved to the areas that they moved to and the routes that they took. So this wonderful map of the British colonies was was published in 1755. It was completed by John Mitchell, who had access to all kinds of government records in London to look at, to compile this map of the colonies. The Board of Trade and Plantations, the agency overseeing the colonies before the American Revolution. The leaders of the Board of Trade and Plantations, needed a visual idea of what the British colonies look like, and also get an idea of where the French may be settling and trying to establish settlements, etc. It shows the river systems, it shows the major roads in use, and you also get an idea of where the colonies are located, and the idea of how far west the British thought the American colonies expanded. As you look at this map, you get the impression that the British had control of lands well beyond the Mississippi River. The French and the Spanish colonies might disagree. And also, you do not get an idea from this map of just how many First People nations exist in North America. Remember, the colonists themselves are living right along the eastern coastline, along the Atlantic coast. And then you have numerous nations that live in the western sections of the colonies and into the interior of North America. So it's a good map. It's because it gives you realize British visions of expansion, colonists' vision of where they wanted to expand, where the rivers and roads were, but it is certainly from a European or from a British perspective. So this map does show nicely two roads that were heavily in use. The King's Highway, which extended from Boston to Charleston, South Carolina by the 1730s. And by 1776, it connected with Maine all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. And in the 18th century, it would take a colonist 2 months to travel the length of the King's Highway, about 2 months, and you figure if it takes you 2 months to travel from Boston to Charleston, that's about 20 to 25 miles a day. But I highlighted in yellow the road, the King's Highway. And of course, it includes the Boston Post Road, which connected, of course, Boston with New York. And it continued, down through New Jersey, through portions of Delaware, into Philadelphia, down to Baltimore, and eventually down into Alexandria, Virginia. And from there, it did not follow the route of present-day 95 for fellow Virginians, but what it did do is follow, in many portions, present-day Route 17. So you have Alexandria, the King's Highway running from Alexandria down to Fredericksburg, and then meandering over into the Middle Peninsula, down into the peninsula, stopping in Williamsburg, which was the capital of Virginia in the 1750s when this map was published, to Yorktown, to Hampton, across, of course, you have to cross the Hampton Roads Channel to get to Norfolk. And then from Norfolk, you can make your way on down to Savannah, Georgia. So hopefully this gives you a really good idea of how people could move between the major centers in British North America in the 1750s. Well, what also is occurring is not only are they traveling this route, you have a number of colonists from New England, from Pennsylvania. I had mentioned Quakers earlier, that are traveling down through the Great Wagon Road down into North Carolina. And highlighted in yellow is the route of the Great Wagon Road, the Great Valley Road, which begins in Philadelphia and then connects in Winchester. And the trail itself actually begins in upstate New York. It was early American peoples used it as a trail from New York to travel down into the southern, what we call the southern colonies. Well, it became a well-traveled road in the mid-18th century as people began moving into the South. And so they move into what we Virginians call the Shenandoah Valley. And a good portion of the road that you see on this map now, a good portion of Interstate 81 follows it. Present-day Interstate 81 follows this route. What also happens is in Virginia, you have a road that's in operation by 1746 that connects Alexandria with Winchester, providing Virginians another route to move through some of the hills and through the gaps to get to the western parts of the colony. And there's also a road that I mentioned earlier in another screen called the Fall Line Road. Well, the Fall Line Road started in Fredericksburg, which if you look closely, you should be able to find. And it basically follows Route 1 today. And for a number of Quakers and who quite frankly didn't like traveling through on the Great Wagon Road for a couple of different reasons, they preferred to take the Fall Line Road instead, which led directly into North Carolina. And so for those of you who are wondering where the Fall Line Road was, it follows the Fall Line, Route 1, down into North Carolina. And the reason why this road may have been more popular for people to use instead of traveling along the King's Highway is because it's on the Fall Line. You don't have to deal with tidal marshes. You don't necessarily have to deal with as many muddy roads. There are fewer rivers and creeks and streams to cross over. These are barriers that you don't have to contend with as you use the Fall Line that you do have to contend with when you're using the King's Highway. And of course, there are post offices scattered throughout Virginia. Fredericksburg, Williamsburg. In fact, one of the printers in Williamsburg was apparently his office was also a post office. So, you have Virginians moving, you have information moving, you have communication amongst colonists, taking place. So it's not only just a migration of peoples, it's a migration of communities. I mean, migration of communication, ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And again, these are not roads like 20th century roads. They're creating, pass through woods. They're chopping down trees. There may be a tree stump or two in the middle of the road. So just keep that in mind as you visualize the roads for this time period. So what happens after the American Revolution? Well, you have more roads constructed, and you have people moving to different parts of what is now the United States of America. And we all know that Americans won the American Revolution. We gained independence officially in 1783, and the amount of territory that we acquire vastly extends our boundaries. And so there's plenty of space and plenty of opportunities for Americans to move. And some of the, I don't have all of the roads listed that were developed. There's no way I could do that in this presentation of this nature, but these are important roads that helped contribute to Virginians, New Englanders, people in the middle states and the southern colonies move in early America. So, for example, you have the development of the Mohawk Turnpike, which is Route 5 in New York State. You have the development of the Nashville Road, which connects Knoxville and Nashville. The Natchez Trace, which connected Natchez, Mississippi to Nashville, Tennessee. And again, trace is a really good word to use for this, to describe that road. And then, of course, there's a federal road that began at Fort Wilkinson near Milledgeville, Georgia, and reached Pensacola, Florida. The idea for that federal road was to connect Washington, D.C., to Fort Wilkinson, and then to connect Fort Wilkinson with New Orleans, the United States, by 1806, which is when construction for this began. It's a horse trail, but the idea was to connect the new capital of the United States with New Orleans, and to basically create a post road. So the federal road was really a post road, but it became a well-used highway in the South. So here is the Bradley map again from 1796, showing post routes. So as you can see, there has been an expansion of roads and an expansion of counties in the United States, especially when you compare it to the earlier Mitchell map. You can see how people have just moved and how the boundaries of settlement have just exploded further west. If you look up in New England, especially, you see where the settlement patterns have moved up into Western Massachusetts, into Vermont, into Western New York, up into Maine. And as you look further south, you see roads being established in Western Pennsylvania, into Ohio, into Kentucky, and in the southern colonies as well. Postal roads are connecting communities in the South, into Tennessee, into Georgia, and eventually with New Orleans, which is not a part of the United States at this time. So why do you see such an explosion into Western New York, into the western parts of New England? Well, there were a lot of early American nations, indigenous nations, that lived in these areas. And it wasn't until after the American Revolutionary War that you see nations like the Iroquois nations leave New York to move to Canada. And when they do, it opens up opportunities for um, New Yorkers to expand into the area. Up until the American Revolution, a great many New Yorkers lived in what was called the Hudson River Valley. And so you see the location of Albany, and of course you see the settlements along the Hudson River, and of course into the eastern parts of New York State. Well, by 1795, you see a very different New York. You see where New Yorkers and people from New England have moved into the western parts of New York. A number of New Englanders who can travel, who can take the Boston Post Road down to Long Island and then take the Hudson River and then connect with the Mohawk Turnpike in Albany. And the Mohawk Turnpike ends up connecting basically from like Buffalo to Albany, and it very closely follows the route of the future Erie Canal. And for those of you who might have New York connections, this also closely follows present-day Route 5 in upstate New York. It's a very pretty area. If you haven't had the opportunity to drive Route 5, it's really pretty. But you see how you have new counties and new settlements being established in New York State, and as we saw on the previous maps, into western parts of New England. And in Nashville, the Nashville Road, well, not Kentucky, but Tennessee becomes a state in the 1790s, and they find a need to construct a road between Knoxville and Nashville. And so they do. It's called the Nashville Road. And this is blurry and I apologize for it, but the dotted lines that lead from Knoxville, which you can see a square noting the location of Knoxville to Nashville, on the map, and it's not a straight line, that's for sure, which seems to indicate that they're going through gaps and paths within the mountain ranges of Tennessee to get to Nashville. And then, of course, this is a great opportunity for people in Knoxville to connect with Nashville and with people further south, because the Natchez Trace connects Nashville with Mississippi in the Creek area, where there are a number of Creek Indians living. And then you have, which I don't have a map up showing, you have the Federal Road down in Georgia connecting basically Milledgeville, Georgia, which of course the Federal Road isn't constructed until the early 19th century, but it ends up connecting Milledgeville, Georgia with New Orleans. And that road was a major migratory road for Americans who flooded into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even Florida in the early part of the 19th century. So not only Virginians, but Americans are on the move. And one of the major areas that Americans were interested in moving into after the American Revolution was Ohio. And just to give you an idea of the importance of Ohio in early American history, early United States history, this is a snippet from the Madison map of Virginia, which was published in 1807. They included specifically an inset of Ohio because so many Virginians moved to Ohio after the American Revolutionary War. And so the following map does a nice job of showing how Ohio was split up into several different districts. If you recall, in order for several states to join the United States, in the 1780s, they had to cede up their western lands. And so, of course, Virginia and states like Connecticut ceded up their claims to western lands. Virginians had claims to Ohio. Well, they ceded those to the Articles of Confederation government. And of course, during the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress and the Commonwealth of Virginia tried to encourage men to enlist in the armies by promising them land grants and bounty warrants once the American Revolutionary War ended. So after the war ends, you have a number of soldiers who make claims to their bounty warrants for land in the Ohio area, in Ohio, which is a part of the Northwest Territory, which of course was officially established. Northwest Territory was officially established in the mid 1780s by the Articles of Confederation government. So, and of course, the Articles of Confederation government becomes a new constitutional government, which is in control in the late 1780s into the 1790s and beyond, or constitutional government. But you have a really nice display of how the lands in Ohio were set up. And so those Virginians who were eligible for bounty warrants and pursued getting land in Ohio, they settled in the Virginia Military District. And their property was determined by metes and bounds, which is a very Virginia way of establishing property lines. Not by using a rectangular mode, not by creating townships, but metes and bounds. So you're going to make sure that your property is surveyed from the rock to the river to the tree, to someone's home, and then back to another rock and then to another tree. It can be very frustrating to research properties that were surveyed by metes and bounds, but that's how it was done in the Virginia Military District. In congressional lands, in lands that were settled by the United States government, those were established based on townships, particular modes of survey as identified by the Land Ordinance of 1785. So it's a little different settlement patterns. So who's moving into Ohio? Well, you have people from New England, Virginia, other colonies moving into this area. And what you might find of interest is that northern Ohio tended to be settled by people who were coming from New England, New York, and Pennsylvania, whereas the southern part of Ohio was established by folks coming in from the southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, etc. And so how do you move? Who's moving, etc., etc.? Well, we've already discussed Virginians moving into the Virginia Military District. You can see almost in the middle, the U.S. Military District. Well, that was for those soldiers who received bounty warrants from the United States government, and they moved into those areas. The Connecticut Western Reserve ended up being split between what was called the Connecticut Land Company and the Fire Lands. The Connecticut Land Company was made up of 48 individuals who purchased this area, and I think they were speculators who would then turn around and sell it to other settlers. The Fire Lands were specifically set aside for people in Connecticut who lived in Connecticut towns that were burned down during the American Revolution. So since their towns were basically destroyed, this area was offered to them to settle in. And it's specific towns, certain specific Connecticut towns, people who lived in those towns who were eligible for property for land in the Fire Lands. The Seven Ranges is the first area that was officially surveyed by, for lack of a better phrase, the United States government. And then, of course, the Ohio land purchase. Let's see if we can find that. Congress lands, I think those are areas that were surveyed under congressional oversight and opened up at different times. I think that's what's going on there. But the Ohio Company, which you can see down there towards the bottom, this was sold. This land was sold to a group of to officers and soldiers of the Revolution who came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So if you were to look at Ohio Company, the areas purchased by them, and if you wanted to do a deep dive into some of the place names, you may notice that some of the place names are rather New England in nature. And that's because the people who originally moved there were from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. There's also something called the Sims Purchase, which is over towards my left by the Virginia Military District. A number of people from New Jersey militia members moved into this area. Apparently, they purchased land from John Cleve Sims. And according to this citation that I'm looking at, by 1850, 1/3 of all people born in New Jersey lived in Ohio on the Sims Purchase. There was also something called the Refugee Tract. It's very small. If you look closely, you can see it. That tract was specifically designed for Canadians who lost their homes during the American Revolution because they aided Americans during the war. So again, if you're doing research in that area and you find some names that look a little bit Canadian in nature or British in nature, that's why. So I hope this helps explain why people moved to Ohio after the war, who moved there. Well, how are they getting there? How are they getting to Ohio? Well, let me pull up another map here. We're going to move to a 19th century map so I can explain that a little bit better. But by the beginning of the 19th century, there were different modes of transportation. So here are pictures of stagecoaches. Stagecoach travel was widely in use in the United States during the antebellum period, especially before railroads took over. And so they were a mode of transportation. There were a number of stage roads that were constructed specifically for stagecoach use because stagecoaches also transported the United States mail. And of course, you have a picture over here on my right, which shows a stagecoach stopping off in front of a tavern in Ohio. This apparently was used in an Ohio history exhibit because you can see cars in the background showing the differences in modes of transportation between the 19th century and the 1950s, when I think this picture was originally shown. And here you have the example of a chase. A chase is basically a 1 to 2 person carriage. That drawing is from the early 19th century. And so it gives you an idea of how Americans are traveling through the countryside or in their local areas. And then over here on my left is turnpike routes, because in the 19th century, turnpikes proliferate in the United States, as do toll roads. And I just thought this would be interesting and thought you might find this interesting to see what the rates for tolls were and what was being charged and the names of the vehicles that were traveling along the toll roads because people were transporting their livestock like sheep, hogs, and cattle. Today we have trucks that move packaged goods. Back then, they're transporting their livestock. And then if you look at the kinds of vehicles being used for transportation, a chase, which we have an example of, a chariot, a coach, a stage wagon, phaeton, and then it gives the prices for each. So again, I just wanted to show this because it gives you an idea of how 19th century and late 18th century Americans are thinking about travel and what they would have to pay if they're traveling on a turnpike road. So anyway, by the 19th century, and I am going to get to Ohio and show how people got to Ohio. I'm getting there. But Americans, they seek to improve their transportation infrastructure, especially after the War of 1812, because that really identified some of the major problems with our transportation structure. And you see the states begin to focus on building turnpikes, canals, toll roads, even post roads. And the federal road, as had mentioned earlier, that was okayed by Thomas Jefferson around 1806. And then, of course, the national road which was a federally funded road project, was also the legislation for that was passed in the early 19th century, and it opened and it was in operation for portions of the road by 1818, and of course by 1840, actually by 1838, but 1840 you could say that the national road extended from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois. So this map shows in blue highlight where the national road was. Well, if you're traveling into Ohio in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and you're traveling in from New England, you could travel down by boat to Philadelphia and then use the Forbes Road to travel to Pittsburgh and then travel by ferry or by boat um, along the rivers there to move into the Ohio region. If you're from New England or New York, you could also just use the Mohawk Turnpike to make your way to Lake Erie and travel down Lake Erie to the northern parts of Ohio. If you live in the southern states, you could use the Great Wagon Road that we've seen travel through Virginia and then which connects to the Wilderness Road that will take you through Kentucky. And eventually there are roads from Kentucky that emerged that will bring you to Ohio. You can also use what was the James River Kanawha Turnpike, which was a road that basically connected Richmond. You would travel the James River and then move to the James River, I guess walk over to the Kanawha River and then meander your way up into Kanawha to the Ohio River, I'm assuming. If not the Ohio River, one of the other rivers, but then use the river system to move into Ohio. There weren't a lot of, in the 18th century, there weren't a lot of ways to get through the mountains to the Ohio River Valley. You could use, of course, the river systems using Lake Erie. You could travel by the Potomac River. You could also travel by the James River Kanawha connection, but there weren't very many ways to get to Ohio otherwise. And of course, the number of roads, the important roads that you would use to get into Ohio really didn't exist until the 18th century. So you have, you have Americans on the move. And as they move, they take their place names with them. And so you can oftentimes figure out where the original settlers come from by looking at the names for specific towns. And if you're doing research about an ancestor, you might be able to look at an older map, might find a name mentioned in a document. You can look at an older map to figure out just where that place is now. Well, 19th century, we are coming to the end, and thank you for staying with me for so long, for hanging in there. This map is a map of Virginia. As part of the goal of developing Virginia's infrastructure, Virginia, like a lot of states, began publishing and creating state maps. This map that you see is a map of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It was the first official state map sanctioned by Virginia, published in 1826. It took about 10 years to put together. And it identifies the roads and the waterways. And it also provides Virginians and the Board of Public Works, which oversaw internal improvements. It also gives them the ability to plan for road construction, canal construction, toll roads, etc., etc. And this map was, constructed from manuscript maps that look like this. There were 106 manuscript maps completed for each county in Virginia underneath the supervision of John Wood and Herman Boyer. And it's from these maps, which vary in size, that were used to compile this map. This is a wall map. It's about 44 square feet. There is a really nice copy of it on display in the exhibition if you want to go see it. The original of this is also on display in the exhibition right now if you would like to go see it. And for those of you who graduated from Virginia Tech, Blacksburg is noted right there. Christiansburg is not far away. And you see the major roads in use in Virginia. They're colored in red, the waterways in blue. And you'll notice that the mountains are often in a blue watercolor. So these manuscript roads, this manuscript maps identified post roads, stage roads, important creeks, waterways, etc., important settlements, taverns, important industries that existed in Virginia, which those who are establishing Virginia's transportation route or transportation infrastructure, they needed to know this information. So thank you for attending the Early American Migrations presentation. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat and I will see if I can get to them. So, okay, let me stop the share. Okay, the first question that I have here, and and let me know if I need to answer any more. The manuscript maps are online. The ones from the Board of Public Works are online, the wood maps, and they're in our digital collections discovery portal on our website, and you will be able to get to those. Also, if you do a catalog search, you'll be able to get to the Board of Public Works maps. Keep in mind, there were 106 maps that were completed. The library only has 40 original now. So a lot of them disappeared or in someone's attic. And there's a few that are in other institutions. So just remember that there were originally 106, but it's down to 40 at the Library of Virginia now. Here we go. So the migration of enslaved persons west towards the Blue Ridge as a haven to live while avoiding capture and crossing the Blue Ridge to further avoid recapture. That is an interesting question. I do not know if someone has done research on that, but I would suspect it would involve using the roads or using the pathways, and it also the time of day may play a role as to how they traveled. That's a great question, which I would actually have to do the research into to try to find an answer to that question. And is the King's Highway more or less modern US Route 1? No, parts of it are, not all of it. And there is, if you do a Google search and you Google King's Highway, there should be a page or two that shows up explaining what routes, basically, which modern day roads help comprise the King's Highway. Specifically in Virginia, the King's Highway is modern Route 17, especially Route 1, I guess, from Alexandria to Fredericksburg, and then from Fredericksburg south is Route 17. Were some of these roads built off of trails originally created and used by indigenous peoples of North America? Yes, they were. Absolutely. The Great Wagon Trail is an excellent example of that. Absolutely, no question. Yes. What is a trace? A trace is it's a dirt path. It is basically a dirt path. It's really, you could call it a road. It's a horse path. It's a dirt path. It's a way to get from one community to another, but they called it the Natchez Trace. The site for the Ohio map, I could provide the, I'd have to look up the source for that. But I think I got it from I know where I got it from, and I can't find it right now. So, can the general public copy of the maps that are at the Library of Virginia? Oh, yes. You can download those. These are, they're, what is the word I'm looking for? They're in the open domain. If they're published in the 19th century and 18th century, these maps are in the public domain and you can get to them. Does the library have individual county maps? Yes, we do. 40, 39, and 40 if you count the chart of Tank, which John Wood helped put together. And is modern day Route 7 the road you mentioned heading west from Alexandria? I think it is, but don't quote me on it. I'd have to look that up. And why did coastal Virginians migrate west? Land. Opportunities to start a new life and to land, because tobacco production does wear out the soil, and so you do find people having to move west. And when did they convert dirt roads to permanent surfaces? Okay, so VDOT did not take control of the roads, did not get Virginia out of the mud until the early 1930s. And there were only 3 counties that didn't, there were 3 counties that did not supersede control of their roads to VDOT in 1932, and one of them was Henrico County, Virginia. And up until that point, the roads were maintained by the locality, by the local county governments. And because it was local in Virginia, that also explains why they may not have been in the best of shape, because it wasn't until the 1930s that we got out of the mud. Oh, yes. And Stuart just commented there are still dirt roads in Virginia. Yes, I do not doubt that one bit. So, okay. Well, thank you for coming today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. And I hope you have a good Thursday afternoon. Bye-bye.